Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring werewolf cults in ancient times. With me is P. Sufenas Virius Lupus, who is a practicing polytheist and author of several books of a devotional nature, including A Serpent Path Primer, and also Ephesia Grammata, Ancient History and Modern Practice. He is also known by his legal name, Phillip Bernhardt-House, and he is the author under that name of a very interesting scholarly work called Werewolves, Magical Hounds, and Dog-Headed Men in Celtic Literature. Welcome, Lupus.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. The idea of a werewolf cult might sound very spooky to many of our viewers, but I suppose it would make more sense if we think of it like a wolf clan in a shamanistic or Native American culture.
That's a good way to think of it. We have a bad relationship with the word cult in modern times for certain understandable reasons, but just in terms of its least morally charged meaning, you might say, is it's a practice. Mm-hmm. It's the root word, after all, of the word culture. So certain subcultures in a number of different ancient societies had what we could call werewolf status. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the way to think of it.
Now, the prefix "wer" in werewolf, what does that come from?
So that's Anglo-Saxon, and it means man or human. In Greek, the word is lycanthropos, so lykos is wolf, and then anthropos is human. In Irish, one of the words for werewolf would be ferhu. Fer means man, and then ku means unspecified canid. So it can be dog, it can be wolf. In certain cases, it can be foxes, otters, a number of other animals. They the Irish classed a lot of different animals as a particular type of dog. So a pine marten is a tree dog, an otter is a water dog, and so on and so forth. So in Irish, ferhu could technically be man hound or man wolf, but it's the equivalent term of werewolf.
Now you are dressed in ritual garb, and you are wearing a wolf skin.
Right, or I say she's wearing me. I'm her transportation system at this point. But I've had her for a few years now, and she is. This is the physical manifestation of her particular spirit, and I always have her with me in ritual context, because one of her many roles and one of her many things that she does in our relationship is protect. So I most people, then again, are not going to come up to me and try and attack me when I'm dressed like this on the street, but
yes.
Spiritual protection as well. So I've had, for example, many fewer nightmares since she's come into my life. Various different things that happen in particular ritual contexts, not only having to do with specifically werewolf type activities, but other things she helps with. So it's what in many cultures would be called a spirit spouse relationship. I didn't know that I was going to have one of those until she came into my life, but there it is.
There it is. So it'd be fair to say that you have an intimate spiritual connection with a wolf spirit.
Yes, and have had, long before she came into my life. It's that connection that drove me to study this as a topic. And one of the characters in Irish mythology that's most connected with this is a character called Cuchulainn. And Cuchulainn literally means the hound or the wolf, the unspecified Canaanid word of Cullen. Cullen was a famous smith who had a big, ferocious guard dog. And when Cuchulainn was a child, he killed it because he was coming late to a feast. The dog attacked him like it would anyone. And then once he killed it, he had to replace it and play the role of the hound until another hound could be raised to replace him. So that's one of many reflections in Irish culture of werewolf-type roles and kind of the wider canid connection, dogs, wolves, and other creatures, to warrior activities, to spiritual activities, into these type of societies.
Well, the fact of the matter is that humans and canines have had a long, intimate relationship going well back before recorded history.
Oh yeah, I mean, the first domesticated animal, and in fact, something that has been discussed is that dogs and wolves, as well as humans, are one of the few mammals, at least, that I'm aware of, that we have different colors in our eyes so that you can tell which way you're looking. Same is true of dogs. And it's been suggested that that's something that happened in our coevolution that allowed us to get along that much better with dogs because we could tell which way they were looking. It's much harder to do that with animals that don't have differentiated parts of their eye.
Well, the ancient Egyptian religion included gods, deities, with the human body and the head of a dog or a wolf or canine of some sort, Anubis.
Right. And it is debated what animal that is. It's often been said it's a jackal, but it's not quite a jackal. There is a theory out there that it might be an extinct species now called the Egyptian golden wolf. It might just be some kind of particular type of dog or a very stylized type of dog. But yeah, that's certainly part of it. The connections that exist there with Anubis in terms of being an underworld guide, psychopomp, guardian of the underworld, connected with the dead and things like this. Some of those connections exist in many of these other cultures with werewolf societies, werewolf cults.
Well, let's talk about the werewolf societies. Obviously, well, it may not be obvious to all of our viewers, but I'm going to presume that for the most part, we are not talking about the literal physical transfiguration of a human being into another animal species.
No, that happens in later stories. But that having been said, our earliest story of a werewolf is the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Oh.
And so many of the great themes and themes that are of particular interest to me happen in that
And Gilgamesh is one of the oldest stories known to humankind.
Yeah, it's really the oldest continuous narrative that we know of at this point.
Goes back to ancient Sumeria.
Right. And there's an incident in there when Inanna is offering herself to Gilgamesh and he refuses. And she says, oh, you know the story of that shepherd that I offered myself to, and he refused me, and I turned him into a wolf, and he was chased and eaten by his own dogs. So it's similar to the Actaeon myth in Greek culture in many respects, where Actaeon happens upon Artemis bathing and then is turned into a stag, and his own hounds hunt him down and kill him.
I see.
But that story as well probably emerges from this type of werewolf cult. The young hunter-warrior that lives on the edges of society and that is identified with different animals, often wolves, often deer and stags and things like that. They are not supposed to have sexual relationships of a conventional nature. In fact, one of the earliest appearances of werewolves in Indo-European culture is in the Hittite laws of about 1300 to 1100 BCE, where if someone practices what's called marriage by capture or marriage by abduction, or it's sometimes called marriage by rape, the text on it says, you have become a wolf.
Oh.
And that would be something that people in these werewolf societies would have had to do. They were outside of the law. They were outside of society. They weren't supposed to do legitimate things like get legitimately married. So if they tried to have a relationship, it would automatically be considered marriage by capture. They have become a wolf.
I see.
So there's many dimensions to this.
Mm-hmm. But I gather the idea is here that they become the wolf through active imagination, through, one might even say, astral travel. That way they identify with, one might say, the hunter or the predatory spirit of the wolf.
Yes, and in certain cases, for example, there's some wonderful Irish texts about this that would be what we would call an astral or maybe an oineric werewolf, where essentially there's a group of people. Incidentally, if you know anyone named Fitzpatrick, mm-hmm. the Fitzpatrick family can trace their history back in an area called Ossory, which is near modern Kilkenny in Ireland. And their history, their earliest ancestor in Irish tradition is a figure called Lagnach Féled, and Féled means wolf. Mm-hmm. And he was said to have been the first one to become a wolf. And in one of the texts that's associated with that group of people in Ossory, essentially what happens is the people who are werewolves in that family, they go to sleep, their soul flies out of their body, and it inhabits an actual wolf. Mm-hmm. And then they run around as a wolf at night. If you move their body, their soul can't get back to it. Mm-hmm. But despite that, if they get hurt in the form of the wolf, they have that wound on the body. Oh. And if they eat something as the wolf, they will wake up with blood and meat in their mouth. Mm. So that's one version of it. In other versions, it says that Saint Patrick was mad at them. That's in an Old Norse version of this story that takes place in Ireland. Yeah. Saint Patrick was mad at that clan because while he was preaching, they all stood around and howled as wolves. And so he said, well, fine, you want to act like wolves, you're going to be wolves. And so from thenceforward, they would actually turn into wolves.
Because of a curse from the Christian saint.
Exactly. Yeah. Uh-huh. And so there's various different versions of that where the saint might be a different person in each one. And some of those then get into a physical transformation. Some of them indicate this kind of astral or dream-based werewolf activity, and some of them are just very metaphorical, as most of these werewolf societies were. In an ecstatic state, possibly even using substances like henbane, which is a topical hallucinogen. It causes both feelings of flight, so it was used in some witch ointments, but also feelings of growing hair on the body. Mm. So it's very possible that this was used in some of these cults in order to have that feeling of becoming a wolf before going into battle or doing other things.
Well, I suppose it's useful to mention in this context the city of Rome was, according to tradition, founded by wolves.
Right. Romulus and Remus, they were fathered by Mars. Mm-hmm. Their mother, in some versions, was a Vestal virgin, and so she had to hide that she had given birth, and so she set the children adrift in a basket on a river. Familiar story. And then eventually what happened was a she-wolf found them, threw her own pups into the river, and then raised them as her own. Mm-hmm. And they had an existence as hunter warriors outside of society. Yeah. Yearly on the Lupercalia ritual, which is February 15th, there was a priesthood called the Luperci, and new ones would be initiated every year from amongst the noble youths. It took place in a cave on the Palatine Hill where the she-wolf supposedly suckled Romulus and Remus. The ritual would take place there. There would be a sacrifice of a dog and a goat. The blood from the sacrifice would be placed on the foreheads of the Luperci. They would then dip wool in milk, wipe the blood off, and then everyone laughed. There was ritual laughter. Ritual laughter is a foolproof ritual because there's nothing funnier than someone pretending to laugh. You know, you can imagine these Roman patricians up there going ha 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 ha, and that's just hilarious.
But it becomes contagious at that point.
Exactly, and when we do this ritual these days, I always make it in fairness, when we initiate new Luperci, they've got we use wine instead of blood, and then they've got milk and wine dripping down their faces at that point. They start to get the giggles. And if people don't start really laughing, then oftentimes what I do is I start running around and flinging milk on everyone, which then definitely gets them laughing, if not screaming. But then once they do that, they run the bounds of the old sacred boundaries of the city. Now what that is it's a reintegration into society ritual of youths would spend time in this werewolf society, on the edge of society or outside of it, but then eventually would come in and become full citizens again. And so this was a reintegration that now their powers and their strengths and so forth that they used to have out in the wilderness to survive is now at the service of the community. They run the bounds of the community to say, this is what we protect now. We no longer reave and act as wild beasts. We are civilized people back in society again. The Romans forgot what that ritual was kind of about. It became about a number of other things as well. Promoting fertility was part of it. They would use the skin of the goat that was sacrificed. They would cut it into strips and run around, and when they were running around the city, people would get slapped across the hands to promote fertility and good fortune. So that was part of their role. They used to be outside of society. They survived that phase in their life, and now they're reintegrated.
Well, somehow in modern times, the notion of the werewolf has become inextricably linked with the horror genre of literature. Something changed from a practice that was more essentially shamanic and spiritual.
And a rite of passage. That's one of the things that happens in the Irish tradition, is that after someone was fostered for 7 years, from the age of 7 to 14, then they went into the Fianna. And the Fianna and the Fainted Warriors, for people who aren't familiar with that, I always describe it as Irish knight with a K, pirate ninja werewolves. That's kind of the best way to understand it in shorthand. They would then be in that until they inherited. And both young men and women would be in that phase in many cases. Women less often, but they were. So it's this rite of passage, and we get in all of the medieval werewolf stories, the most popular ones, the werewolf is the good guy. The werewolf is the character that we sympathize with. The werewolf is the one that somebody has done wrong by. It's usually their wife or lover or wicked stepmother or somebody who condemns them to live as a wolf. And then what distinguishes them is they are a wolf that's rational. They're a wolf that clearly is more than just a wolf. Whereas today, I think, due to various cultural factors, it's more frightening to us to imagine the animal in the human rather than finding the human in the animal. So often people make a distinction between humans and animals, and yet we are all animals.
Indeed we are. And yet it does seem like we are animals and something else as well.
Certainly. And that, that extends to a lot of other things, but that's part of the, I think the mystique of the medieval werewolf stories is that what they end up focusing on is that can you maintain your humanity in a situation that turns you barbarous. In some of the ancient Greek stories, for example, when the Arcadians, who were particularly associated with werewolves, they would go through this phase. And if they killed a human while they were in wolf form, they couldn't turn back. But if they just maintained a life as a wolf, as you should be, and kind of realized, okay, yes, I'm animal, but I'm not going to take human life, then things will be okay.
You used a term quite a ways back, and I want to define it for our readers and explore it a little more with you. Oniric.
Right. So that is basically anything having to do with dreams. And dream work is something that's important to my practice of polytheism and to many people's practices. It's one of those realms where you can interact with all kinds of beings that you don't get to on an everyday basis.
In the dream, animals take on a life of their own, a dream life.
Oh yeah, and almost every animal in my dreams these days talks. It's very odd to get a silent animal for me. So that's something that happens. But this is part of it, and kind of that set of practices and that set of associations comes into lots of different aspects of many different polytheistic cults, but the werewolf thing as well.
And I know the wolf is important to you in several regards. You're wearing her, or she's wearing you, as you pointed out. Your spiritual name, Lupus, is derived from the word for wolf, but there's even more to it.
Right. It's interesting. I mean, a lot of people point that out, but the Virius Lupus part of my name comes from a series of individuals who existed in late antiquity who, other than the name, don't have a lot to do with wolves. But of course, anyone who would have heard their name in those times, they would immediately understand what it meant.
Yes.
P. Sufenas, on the other hand, was a Lupercus, as well as a priest of Antinous in a fratria in Neapoli, which is to say modern Naples.
A Lupercus.
A Lupercus. So he was somebody who was initiated in the Lupercalia ritual.
And Lupercalia being?
February 15th, that ritual of reintegration that commemorates Romulus and Remus
the
being...
ritual we just described.
Yes.
And in case any of our viewers missed it, lupus is the Latin word for wolf.
Right, one of them. Yes. There's interesting things about... there's a number of interesting words that may have meant wolf. One of the Roman Emperor Trajan was from the Ulpii, Ulpii, and that was probably an old Umbrian word for wolf. So there's a number of different Latin cultures, italic cultures, that had different words for it. And lupus is kind of an unusual one in certain respects, because in Greek it's lycos. In most other Indo-European languages, it tends to favor more the guttural consonants than P's and B's and things like that. So there's a whole linguistic element to it as well.
But in any case, the notion of the werewolf cult and the werewolf culture is that there is a kinship that humans have with canines and wolves in particular that allows the human to become, if not become a wolf literally, to become like a wolf inside of one's psyche.
Yes. And I think that for the cultures which had this institution, it was usually associated with young people. In Sparta, the Crypteia ritual, which those who have seen or read the book 300, that's dramatized fairly accurately in there. Somewhat problematic, but
That's an interesting movie, the 300, and the sequel. Obviously, they're highly dramatized.
Oh, of course.
There's a large element of Hollywood there.
Oh, yes, very definitely. But the Crypteia ritual of the young person being sent out into the wilderness to survive on their own, that's an example of this. The Athenian ephebit that took place with young adults, probably, around the age of 15 to 20, that's another example of it. The Irish Fianna, certainly. There were many others. What this probably did, amongst other things, was it was a way to channel that youthful rambunctiousness and potential to be antisocial into something else. So that if you're going to be a rebellious teenager, okay, fine, do it out in the woods so that you don't hurt anyone. Do it out there so that you don't impregnate a whole bunch of people. Do it out there so that you don't damage our property. And then if you're out there and you're one of these youthful hunter warriors, one of the main things that they did was that even though they were considered outside of the group, for example, in Ireland, they were the first line of defense if some other tribe came to invade. Or they also could be used to carry out missions into other tribes. So kind of intertribal mercenaries almost, if you like. They could be used for that because they no longer had social standing in their own tribe, and then there was plausible deniability.
Well, and it also seems to me that there's some at least hint that they might get in touch with the guidance of the psychopomp spirit of Anubis.
Oh, absolutely.
That there's a wisdom to be found there in communion with an animal spirit.
Right. And something that happens in descriptions of werewolf activities from later periods, but very likely this happened in earlier ones as well, is that they were also the spiritual defenders of the tribe. They could represent the dead and ancestors because they were kind of half dead themselves. They were dead as far as the legal systems in their tribes were concerned. So they walked this kind of liminal path, and they did otherworld travel to do things on behalf of their tribes. Very commonly what the Fianna in Irish tradition does is protect from invaders, but also go into the other world to negotiate with otherworld powers, deities, ancestors, and so on, and to make these adventures into those areas, sometimes to steal treasures, sometimes to bring back different things that would benefit people, sometimes to bring back knowledge.
Well, our time is up once again. P. Sufenas Virius Lupus. What an educational and enlightening experience this has been.
Thank you so much for letting me share it with you. This has been very fun.
Thank you for being with me. And thank you for being with us.